Would you dare? No radio, no satellite maps, no rescue ship on standby, no way to call home and say, I made it, or something's wrong. Just you, a few hundred strangers crammed onto a wooden ship, and an ocean that swallowed every sailor who came before you, and never explained why. Here's what almost nobody explains before jumping into these stories. Why would anyone risk their life for this? The answer is a handful of tiny islands most people today couldn't find on a map. The Spice Islands, deep in what's now Indonesia, along with the wider region called the East Indies. Cinnamon, pepper, nutmeg, cloves. In Europe, these weren't just kitchen ingredients. They were worth more than gold, ounce for ounce. A single sack of nutmeg could set a family up for generations. Entire kingdoms funded voyages that had almost no chance of success because whoever controlled the sea route to those spices controlled the wealth of an entire continent. That's what was actually on the other side of that horizon. Not glory. Money so enormous, it was worth gambling your life for. Would you dare sail toward a horizon that mapmakers simply gave up drawing because nobody who went that far ever came back to describe what was there? Would you dare keep going after watching half your crew die of a disease nobody understood? Their gums bleeding, their teeth falling out, their bodies giving up one organ at a time? Would you dare stay calm while your own ship was being crushed by ice, plank by plank, with nowhere on Earth for a rescue party to even begin looking for you? 3 men said yes. Not because they weren't afraid, because they decided the fear wasn't going to be the thing that stopped them. One of them paid for that decision with his life. This is the story of 3 voyages that should have ended in death, and the price each one of these men paid, chasing a route to riches most of them never lived to spend. July 1497. 4 ships, around 170 men. 1 mission, find a sea route from Europe straight to India, and by extension, the Spice Islands beyond it, without a single European having ever completed that journey and lived to describe it. Most people assume the hardest part was distance. It wasn't. The hardest part was that nobody actually knew if a route even existed. Earlier expeditions had tried to round the southern tip of Africa and simply never returned. No maps, no charts, no way to know if the ocean even connected the way they hoped it did. Picture the ship itself. No engine, obviously, just wind and prayer. Men slept stacked shoulder to shoulder below deck, in air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, rotting food, and bilge water sloshing beneath their feet. Fresh water turned green and foul within weeks. The biscuit they ate was often crawling with weevils by the time anyone touched it. And they ate it anyway, because the alternative was starving. And then there was scurvy. Nobody in 1497 understood it was caused by a lack of vitamin C. All they knew was that after 2 or 3 months at sea, men's gums would start to bleed. Old wounds would reopen. Teeth would loosen and fall out. Men who'd been strong and healthy weeks earlier could barely stand. On da Gama's voyage, scurvy killed more men than any storm, any battle, any single disaster. It just quietly took them, one at a time, far from anyone who could help. 3 months without sighting land, morale collapsing, sailors openly demanding they turn the ships around before they all died out there together. Da Gama refused. He knew that if he was wrong, the ocean would simply keep the secret forever, and no one back home would ever learn what happened to any of them. They finally rounded the Cape of Good Hope, a passage so violent it had already destroyed other expeditions, and picked up a local navigator familiar with the monsoon winds who helped guide them the rest of the way. On May 20th, 1498, da Gama's ships dropped anchor near Kapad, just outside the city of Calicut, on India's southwestern coast, the exact spot where a European fleet touched Indian soil for the first time in recorded history. But here's the part that almost never makes it into the story, and it might be the most devastating moment of the entire voyage. The journey home was worse than the journey there. Recrossing the Indian Ocean took over 3 months of brutal, relentless sailing, and scurvy tore through the crew even harder than before. Men were dying faster than the survivors could process. By the time the fleet limped into the port of Malindi, on the coast of East Africa, there simply weren't enough living men left to sail all 4 ships home. One of those ships was the São Rafael, captained the entire voyage by Vasco da Gama, Vasco's own older brother. There was no choice left. Da Gama had to strip the São Rafael of its crew and supplies, and give the order to burn his brother's ship to the waterline, right there on the African coast, thousands of miles from home. Picture what that actually meant. A ship that had carried men across an unmapped ocean, that Paulo had commanded through storms and mutiny and disease, reduced to ash, because there weren't enough living hands left to sail her. And Paulo himself was gravely ill by then, weakened by the same disease that had killed so many of his men. Vasco brought his dying brother aboard the flagship and pressed on. Paulo never made it home. He died in the Azores, just 1 stop away from Portugal, with his brother at his side. Of the roughly 170 men who left Portugal, only around 55 made it home alive. But here's what makes all of it matter. Da Gama became the first European in history to reach India by sailing there directly, opening a sea route that would reshape global trade for centuries. He got his name carved into history and returned to a hero's welcome. But he came home having burned his own brother's ship, and having buried that same brother before ever setting foot on Portuguese soil again. Da Gama proved a sea route to the riches of the East was possible, and he paid for it with almost everyone he sailed beside. But the next man on our list decided that wasn't ambitious enough. He wanted to sail all the way around the entire planet. He never lived to see if it worked. 1519. 5 ships. 270 men. A goal that had never even been attempted in human history. Sail west and keep going until you circle the entire globe and find a westward route to those same Spice Islands that had already cost Da Gama's crew so much. Magellan wasn't fully trusted by his own crew before they'd even left port. He was Portuguese, leading a Spanish fleet on the most dangerous voyage anyone had ever proposed, and plenty of his officers resented taking orders from him. Before he'd even reached the treacherous strait at the tip of South America, 3 of his 5 ship captains turned against him, attempting to seize control of the fleet in open mutiny. Magellan crushed it, executing the ringleaders and marooning others on a desolate stretch of coastline, then pressed on through a maze of narrow, freezing channels so dangerous that sailors still treat that passage with caution today. Then came the ocean Magellan named the Pacific, believing it would take a matter of days to cross. It took over 3 months. Food ran out completely. Sailors were reduced to eating leather stripped from the rigging, sawdust, and rats when they could catch them. Scurvy tore through the crew exactly as it had with Da Gama's men, killing dozens along the way, their bodies simply given to the sea, because there was nowhere else to put them. On March 16th, 1521, after 3 brutal months crossing the Pacific, Magellan's fleet sighted land, the small island of Homenhon, in what's now the Philippines. Half-starved and desperate for a victory, Magellan became the first European to ever make contact with the islands, a moment that would connect this part of the world to Europe for the first time in recorded history. But instead of it becoming his triumph, it became his downfall. Weeks later, on April 27th, 1521, he inserted himself into a local conflict between rival island chiefs on the nearby island of Mactan. Certain his weapons and armor made his small landing party unbeatable. He was wrong. Magellan was struck down and killed on the shore of Mactan Island, never seeing home again, never learning whether his mission would even succeed. Here's the part that makes this story remarkable. His crew didn't give up. Out of the original 270 men and 5 ships, only one battered ship and 18 surviving men made it all the way back to Spain. 3 long years after they'd left, completing the very first circumnavigation of the Earth in human history. Magellan started it. He never lived to see it finished. It was finished without him, by 18 exhausted strangers who refused to let his death be the end of it. He gave everything to a journey he didn't survive, and 18 exhausted strangers carried the rest of it home for him. Magellan lost his life chasing the edges of the map, but our final explorer faced something even more merciless. Not a fight with rival men, but a fight against the planet itself, in the single most unforgiving place on Earth. 1914. Shackleton set out with one goal: be the first person in history to cross Antarctica on foot. He never got the chance to even try. His ship, the Endurance, became trapped in the pack ice of the Weddell Sea, one of the most hostile and least forgiving stretches of ocean on the entire planet. Hundreds of miles from open water, for months his crew listened to the hull groan and crack as the ice slowly crushed it, beam by beam, until the ship finally split apart and sank completely, leaving 28 men stranded on a drifting ice floe in temperatures cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes, with no radio, no rescue plan, and no one on Earth who even knew where to start looking for them. Think about what those months actually looked like: sleeping on ice that could crack open beneath you at any moment, rationing food so carefully that men were slowly starving, even while technically being fed. Watching sled dogs, animals many of the crew had grown attached to, put down, because there simply wasn't enough food to keep them alive. Frostbite eating away at fingers and toes, and above all, the psychological weight of not knowing if any of it would matter, if help was even a possibility. Most people think Shackleton's story is about reaching Antarctica. It isn't. His mission failed before it even truly began. What makes him legendary isn't what he set out to do. It's what he chose to do after everything fell apart. Shackleton made a decision historians still study today. He decided the mission was no longer the crossing. It was getting every single one of his men home alive. He led them across shifting, cracking ice for months. Then, in April 1916, he loaded them into small lifeboats for a brutal, freezing crossing to Elephant Island, a barren, uninhabited scrap of rock so far off any shipping route that no rescue ship would ever think to look there. From there, Shackleton chose 5 men to join him on what should have been a suicide mission, an 800-mile crossing of some of the most violent open ocean on the planet, in a boat barely 22 feet long, betting everything on reaching a whaling station that might not even still be operating. They made it. 16 days at sea, through waves capable of swallowing the tiny boat whole. In May 1916, they reached South Georgia Island, only to find the whaling station was on the opposite side, across a mountain range no human being had ever crossed on foot. Shackleton and 2 others climbed it anyway. No proper climbing equipment, no maps of the terrain. This after already surviving over a year at the edge of starvation. Every single man who set out on that ice floe made it home alive. 28 men, stranded at the literal bottom of the world with nothing. And every one of them survived. Shackleton's actual mission was a complete failure. He never crossed Antarctica. He never accomplished the single goal that brought him there. And yet history remembers him as one of the greatest leaders who ever lived. Because when everything collapsed around him, he refused to let it cost a single life. Da Gama's courage was defiance, sailing toward a route that might not have even existed, and paying for it with the ship and eventually the life of his own brother. Magellan's courage was sacrifice, giving everything to a journey he knew he might never live to finish. And Shackleton's courage was responsibility, failing completely and choosing to make sure that failure didn't cost anyone their life. Here's what ties all three of them together. None of them were fearless. Fear was there the entire time, in the storms, the starvation, the ice, the silence of an ocean that had already killed men just like them. What made them different wasn't the absence of fear. It was what they did while carrying it anyway. So ask yourself the same question these men had to answer with their lives. If you had no map, no rescue, and no guarantee of coming home, would you still go? Drop your answer in the comments, because I read every single one. And if a mission fails completely, but every person still comes home alive, is that failure? Or is that actually the greatest kind of success there is? If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs a reminder that greatness isn't the absence of fear. It's what you choose to do in spite of it. And subscribe, because next week we're telling another story like this one. Until then, would you dare? I'll see you in the next one.